And hair in the medieval period was never just hair. It was a message. It told people who you were. It showed your status, your age, and your place in the world. For a woman, long hair was her glory. It was a powerful symbol of her femininity and her fertility. Young, unmarried girls were often allowed to wear their hair down and uncovered. It flowed freely, a sign of their youth and availability. You see this in paintings and read about it in stories. A girl with her hair loose was a maiden, but once a woman married, things changed. Her hair was no longer just her own, it belonged to her husband and her household. Modesty became the rule. A respectable married woman covered her hair in public. She would braid it, twist it into buns, and then cover it with a veil, a wimple, or a net. This covering was a signal to the world. It said she was married and off limits. It was a sign of her respectability and her commitment to her family and God. To see a married woman's uncovered hair in public was scandalous. It was seen as shameless, even an invitation. The only times a good woman might show her hair were in the privacy of her home with her husband, or perhaps on her wedding day. There were exceptions, of course. Queens and noblewomen on ceremonial occasions might wear their hair down, often with a crown on top. It was a display of power and lineage. But for the everyday woman, the rules were clear. Hair was private. It was a treasure to be guarded. The church had a lot to say about this. They drew on stories from the Bible. Eve's long hair was tied to her temptation of Adam. But Mary Magdalene famously washed Christ's feet with her hair, a sign of her repentance and humility. So hair was a contradiction. It was both a woman's crowning glory and a potential source of sin and vanity. It had to be controlled. For men, hair also sent strong signals, but the signals were different and they changed more often. In the early medieval period, among Germanic tribes like the Franks, long hair and a beard were signs of a free man's power and authority. To cut a king's hair was to strip him of his strength and his right to rule. These kings were sometimes called the long-haired kings. Shaving a man's head was a deep humiliation, something done to defeated enemies or criminals. As the centuries went on, styles shifted. By the High Middle Ages, a man's hair was more about his profession. Soldiers and working men often kept their hair shorter. It was practical. It stayed out of their eyes and was less likely to get grabbed in a fight. Noblemen had more freedom. They might wear their hair chin length or to their shoulders. It was a sign that they didn't do manual labor. A well-groomed head of hair and a neat beard showed that a man had the time and money to care for his appearance. And then there were the monks. A monk's haircut, the tonsure, was a direct rejection of worldly vanity. The shaved patch on the crown of the head was a symbol of their devotion to God. It was a way of saying that they had given up personal pride and status. Their hair no longer mattered because their life was dedicated to something higher. So, for a man, his hairstyle could tell you if he was a king, a knight, a farmer, or a man of God. Social class was woven into every strand. A wealthy person, man or woman, had access to better tools. They had combs made of ivory, not just simple wood. They had servants to help them braid and style their hair. They could afford ribbons of silk and pins of silver. They also had the leisure time to maintain complex styles. A peasant woman working in the fields needed a hairstyle that was simple and secure. She'd have her hair in a single, thick braid, tucked under a coarse linen cap to keep it out of the dirt and the machinery. Her hair care was about function. A lady of the court, on the other hand, might have elaborate twin braids coiled over her ears and encased in a golden net called a caul. Her hair care was about display. The color of your hair mattered too. In the poetry and romances of the time, the ideal beauty was almost always a woman with golden blonde hair. It was celebrated in songs and stories. This doesn't mean everyone was blonde. Most people in Europe were brunette. But blonde was the fantasy. It was associated with youth, light, and purity. Red hair was more ambiguous. It was sometimes seen as a sign of a fiery temperament or even witchcraft, a prejudice that lingered for centuries. His dark hair was simply common, so hair was a language without words. It communicated your identity to everyone you met, telling them where you fit in the strict social order of the medieval world. It was a constant visible marker of your life story. The idea that people in the Middle Ages never bathed is a myth. They didn't have the same standards of hygiene we do today, and cleanliness was certainly harder to achieve. But they did wash themselves, and they did wash their hair. They just did it differently. They valued cleanliness. It was seen as a sign of good health and good morals. Dirtiness was associated with sickness and sin. You couldn't just go to the store and buy a bottle of shampoo. Everything had to be made from scratch, using what you could grow or find. The soap they had was very harsh. It was usually made from lye, which came from wood ash, and animal fat. This kind of soap was great for scrubbing floors or tough laundry, but it was brutal on hair. Using it would leave your hair stripped, dry, and brittle. So, for the most part, people avoided using lye soap directly on their hair unless it was absolutely filthy. Instead, they used gentler methods. The most common way to clean hair was with herbal infusion, and it was like making a strong tea for your hair. A woman would go to her herb garden or forage in the woods for plants known to be good for the hair. Rosemary was a favorite. It was thought to stimulate growth and darken the hair. Sage, mint, thyme, and chamomile were also popular. She would take a handful of these herbs, put them in a pot of water, and bring it to a boil. Then she'd let it cool and steep, straining out the plant matter. This fragrant, herb-infused water was her hair wash. She would lean over a basin and pour it over her head, working it through her hair with her fingers. These washes weren't sudsy like modern shampoos. They didn't contain detergents. They worked by gently dissolving oils and dirt, and they left the hair smelling fresh and clean, like herbs instead of smoke or sweat. Another option was to use soapwort, a plant whose roots and leaves create a mild lather when agitated in water. It was a natural, gentle soap that could clean hair without stripping it. For those who could afford it, powdered orris root from the iris flower could be used as a kind of dry shampoo, absorbing oil and leaving a violet-like scent. After washing, they needed a way to restore the hair's balance. The herbal washes, and especially any lye-based cleaners, were alkaline. This would cause the cuticles on the hair shaft to open up, leaving the hair looking dull and feeling rough. To fix this, they used an acidic rinse. It was the medieval version of a conditioner. A common choice was a rinse of diluted vinegar, usually cider vinegar. Wine was also used. This acidic rinse would smooth the hair cuticle back down, making the hair feel softer and look much shinier. It also helped to remove any soap residue. So the two-step process of an alkaline wash followed by an acidic rinse was actually a very effective way to care for hair. Of course, washing your hair wasn't a daily activity, it was an ordeal. You had to haul the water, heat it over a fire, prepare the herbal wash, and then find a way to dry your hair, which could take hours without a blow dryer. Most people probably wash their hair every week or two, or maybe less often in the cold of winter. They would dry it with linen towels and by sitting near the fire or out in the sun. Between washes, the main tool for keeping hair clean was the comb. Combing was a daily ritual. It removed dirt, dust, and loose hairs. It also distributed the natural oils from the scalp down the hair shaft, which kept the hair conditioned and protected. A thorough combing was a form of dry cleaning for the hair, and it was essential for maintaining long hair and keeping it free of tangles and pests. So while their methods were different from ours, medieval people were not content to live in filth. They had a sophisticated system for hair care, rooted in the natural world around them, that was designed to keep their hair clean, healthy, and smelling good. Once the hair was clean, it had to be styled. For most people, and especially for women, this wasn't about fashion trends in the way we think of them today. It was about managing very long hair and conforming to social expectations. The foundation of almost all female hairstyles was the braid. Braiding was the most practical way to control a huge amount of hair. It kept it from tangling, kept it clean, and formed a stable base for the head coverings that married women were required to wear. The most basic style was a single long braid down the back, common for working women. But more complex styles were also popular. A very common look was to have two long braids. These could hang down on either side of the face, or they could be looped up and pinned at the sides of the head. Another sophisticated style was the coronet or crown braid, where the two braids were wrapped up and over the top of the head like a diadem. This was a neat and elegant way to keep all the hair securely out of the way. These braided styles required skill and sometimes the help of another person to get them just right. But to hold these styles in place, they used a variety of tools. Hairpins were essential. They were made of wood, bone, bronze, or for the wealthy, silver and gold. They didn't look like modern bobby pins. They were longer, straight pins, more like a small needle or skewer. Ribbons were also crucial. A narrow band of linen or silk, called a fillet, could be tied around the head to keep stray hairs back, or woven directly into the braids for decoration and support. These ribbons added a touch of color and were a sign of status. For the upper classes, hairstyling could become very elaborate. One popular accessory was the caul. This was a type of hairnet, often made of fine silk or even gold or silver thread, sometimes decorated with pearls and jewels. The braids would be coiled into buns over the ears, and these buns would be enclosed in the matching cauls. This created a very structured, almost architectural look that was popular in the later Middle Ages. It was a clear display of wealth, as only the rich could afford such delicate and expensive hair accessories. The most important tool for everyone, rich or poor, was the comb. Combs were everywhere in the archaeological record. They were personal, treasured items. Most were made from wood or bone. Wealthier people might have combs made of antler or ivory, sometimes beautifully carved with decorations. Many combs were double-sided. One side had coarse, wide-spaced teeth for detangling thick, wet hair. The other side had very fine, closely spaced teeth. This side was for smoothing the hair and, critically, for removing lice and their eggs, known as nits. The fine-toothed comb was a real and necessary object. People carried their combs with them, sometimes in small leather cases hanging from a belt. It was a tool for daily maintenance. For men, styling was generally simpler. As mentioned, styles ranged from the long flowing hair of early medieval warriors to the shorter, more practical cuts of the later period. One very distinctive late medieval hairstyle was the bowl cut. It looks just like it sounds. The hair was cut evenly all around, as if a bowl had been placed on the head. The back of the neck was often shaved high up. It created a very neat, rounded silhouette. Beards and mustaches were also an important part of a man's look. They could be worn long and full, or neatly trimmed. Sometimes wax was used to shape a mustache into points. A well-kept beard was a sign of masculinity and maturity. Like the hair on their head, a man's facial hair, was a way to express his identity and status. But whether it was a woman's intricate braids or a man's carefully trimmed beard, styling wasn't just about looking good. It was about order. In a world that valued social hierarchy and clear roles, well-kept hair was a sign of a well-ordered person. A messy, unkempt head of hair suggested a chaotic or undisciplined life, so the daily rituals of combing, braiding, and pinning were a small but important part of maintaining social and personal order. Life in the Middle Ages was filled with everyday annoyances we've largely solved, and hair problems were no exception. The single biggest issue, one that crossed all social classes, was head lice. These tiny pests were a constant presence. Living in close quarters with humans and animals, and without modern insecticides, made it very easy for lice to spread. It wasn't necessarily a sign of being dirty, even the cleanest person could pick them up. The first and best line of defense was the fine-toothed comb. The daily ritual of combing was not just for styling, it was a delousing mission. A person would meticulously comb through their hair, section by section, scraping out the adult lice and the tiny white eggs, or nits that were glued to the hair shafts. This was a tedious but effective physical method of control. But when combing wasn't enough, people turned to potions and remedies. These were based on the herbal knowledge of the time. Some of them were sensible. They made washes from herbs that were known to be insect repellents. Wormwood and tansy were common choices. A particularly effective treatment came from the seeds of a plant called stavesacre. The seeds were crushed and mixed with oil or water to create a lotion that was toxic to lice. This was a genuine plant-based insecticide. Other remedies were less effective and more dangerous. And medical texts from the period sometimes recommended treatments containing toxic heavy metals like mercury or arsenic. These would certainly kill the lice, but they could also poison the person using them, causing skin damage, hair loss, and even death if absorbed in large enough quantities. It shows how desperate people were to get rid of the constant itching and social stigma of a lice infestation. And dandruff and other scalp ailments were another common complaint. Itchy, flaky scalps were treated with topical applications. Rinses made from nettle or burdock root were thought to soothe the scalp and reduce flaking. They also made ointments, called unguents, to treat scalp problems. These were usually a base of animal fat, like lard or goose grease, which was then infused with healing herbs. The fat would help to moisturize a dry scalp, while the herbs provided their medicinal properties. Then there was the great fear of hair loss. For men in particular, baldness was a source of anxiety, just as it can be today. They had no understanding of the genetic or hormonal causes of male pattern baldness. Instead, they attributed it to an imbalance of the humors in the body or other external factors. The cures they came up with seem bizarre and often disgusting to us now. They were based on a mix of folklore, observation, and a principle called sympathetic magic, the idea that like affects like. For example, a common belief was that to grow hair, you should apply something from a hairy animal. Therefore, bear grease was a highly prized ingredient in hair growth tonics. The logic was that since bears are very hairy, their fat must contain the essence of hairiness. They would rub the grease vigorously into their scalps. Other remedies were even stranger. Some medieval recipes call for the ashes of burnt bees, or the droppings from a goat, or even a paste made from goose dung, all to be applied to the bald patch. One particularly strange recipe involved burning the genitals of a pig, mixing the ashes with oil, and rubbing it on the head. These treatments likely did nothing more than make a person's head smell awful. But in a world without scientific medicine, people were willing to try anything they thought might work, based on the knowledge and beliefs they had. They also believed certain plants could encourage hair to grow. Rosemary was the most famous. It was used in rinses and oils not just to clean and scent the hair, but specifically to stimulate growth and prevent hair from falling out. This belief in rosemary's power for hair has lasted for centuries and is still popular in natural hair care today. So while some of their solutions were based on sound herbalism, many others were a product of desperation and a very different understanding of how the human body worked. They were fighting these common hair problems with the only tools they had: the plants in their gardens and a whole lot of creative, if misguided, thinking. Still beyond just being clean and tidy, people in the medieval period also cared about the aesthetic qualities of their hair. They wanted it to be beautiful, to have a pleasing color, a nice smell, and a healthy shine. Their ideals of beauty, especially for women, were heavily influenced by the popular literature of the day. The troubadours and poets who wrote tales of courtly love almost always described their heroines with long, shimmering golden hair. This blonde ideal was powerful. Achieving this look wasn't easy, as most people were not naturally blonde. But they did have methods for lightening their hair. There was no chemical bleach, so they used the sun. This was a technique available only to women of leisure, which made it even more desirable. A woman would first apply a lightening agent to her hair. This could be a number of things. A mixture of lemon juice and olive oil was one option. Another was a concoction made from boiling things like onion skins, broom flowers, or alum in lye water. She would then put on a wide-brimmed hat with the crown cut out, so her face was shaded, but her hair was exposed. She would sit in a sunny courtyard for hours, letting the combination of the lightening agent and the sun's rays bleach her hair to a lighter shade. It was a slow, subtle process, but it could produce the coveted golden or reddish blonde tones. Darkening the hair was much easier and more common. For those who wanted to cover gray hairs or simply achieve a rich, dark color, there were many plant-based dyes available. The most effective was made from walnut husks. The green outer husks of walnuts would be boiled to create a powerful brown stain. The oak galls, the small growths on oak trees caused by insects, also produced a dark dye when crushed and boiled. Applying these stains would turn light or graying hair a deep brown or even black. Other plants like sage and rosemary, while used for cleaning, were also thought to gradually darken the hair over time with repeated use. Red hair could be achieved using dyes from the madder plant root, and henna was also known and used in some parts of Europe, especially those with trade connections to the Middle East and North Africa. But for the most part, people worked with what they had, aiming for shades of blonde and brown. Scent was just as important as color. In a world that could be filled with unpleasant odors from poor sanitation, livestock, and wood smoke, personal fragrance was a mark of refinement and cleanliness. Hair, being long and porous, was an excellent carrier of scent. People didn't have alcohol-based perfumes as we do. Instead, they used scented oils and powders. One way to perfume the hair was to create an infused oil. A neutral oil like almond or olive oil would be gently heated with fragrant flower petals such as roses, lavender, or chamomile. The oil would absorb the scent of the flowers. After straining out the petals, a few drops of this precious, fragrant oil could be smoothed onto the ends of the hair or a wooden comb, leaving a subtle, lasting perfume. Another method was to use scented powders. Orris root, the dried root of the iris flower, was very popular. It was ground into a fine powder that has a scent very similar to violets. A woman might dust a small amount of this powder into her hair or even into her hairnet or veil. It acted as a dry shampoo, absorbing oil while also imparting its delicate fragrance. They also stored their combs and hair ribbons in wooden chests with dried lavender or rose petals, so the tools themselves would pick up the scent and transfer it to the hair during styling. Finally, there was the desire for a healthy shine. Dull, lifeless hair was not considered attractive. As mentioned before, the vinegar or wine rinse after washing was the primary method for creating shine. It smoothed the hair's surface, allowing it to reflect more light. Additionally, a very light application of an oil, like almond oil, could add gloss, though they had to be careful not to use too much and make the hair look greasy. A well-brushed head of hair also had a natural sheen. The daily practice of brushing with a boar bristle brush, for those who could get them, would pull the natural sebum from the scalp along the hair shaft, acting as a natural polisher and conditioner. All these small efforts, from lightening with the sun to scenting with flowers, show that medieval hair care was about more than just survival. It was an art, a way for people to strive for an ideal of beauty using the natural materials they had at hand.